Okay, everyone. Hello. Good morning in the US. Good afternoon, evening elsewhere in Europe, Asia, Australia, wherever you're coming from. We're glad you're here. My name's Lauren Hayes. I'm one of the co-organizers of the Find. And today we have a very special kind of Finds seminar. And again, always good to hear my voice in the background. Sorry about that. I could hear the YouTube going on. So we have a special kind of Find seminar today. We're actually having a panel discussion. And really briefly, I want to introduce the panelists, just take a couple of moments, and then we have questions from some students. And so the panelists today, we're excited to have 5 great people with us today. First is Tim Clutton-Brock from Cambridge University in the UK. Tim has run 3 long-term studies, one on the red deer of the Isle of Rome and the soy sheep, and of course the meerkat study in the Kalahari. And these are 3 remarkable studies that involve lots of collaborators and guys you can see have gone on for decades. And Tim gave a seminar, the Find seminar, I believe the 2nd of March in 2021. Dan Blumstein is our next guest. Dan has run long-term studies on yellow-bellied marmots, the Rocky Mountain Biological Laboratory, and intriguingly, his study he inherited from Chem Armitage. And Dan gave a Find seminar on the 1st of September in 2020. Kay Holekamp from Michigan State will be joining us. Kay has been running long-term studies, probably the one that's got the most focus at the Hyena Project in Kenya, but she's also got some long-term work on Belding's ground squirrels in the US. And Kay gave a seminar in November of 2020. Christina Riehl from Princeton University is joining us. She's run long-term study on the greater Anais of Panama since 2006. And Christina gave us a talk on the 17th of November in 2020. And the last panelist is Dustin Rubenstein of Columbia University. Dustin has a long-term study of the superb starlings of Kenya. And that project's been going on since 2001. And Dustin gave a really interesting talk back in the May of 2021 to the Find community. And so we're really thrilled to have all these folks today. For those of you who are joining us, students hopefully joining us, this is a wonderful opportunity. I hope you appreciate the fact that you're going to be hearing from people who have combined over 100 years of long-term research and have been leaders in our field of research. And the questions that I'm going to be presenting to the speakers today come from 4 really good students. Jingyu Qiu from Strasbourg, France, Lindelani Makuya, who's in South Africa, Chyanne Smith, who's in my lab at University of Tennessee at Chattanooga, and Charlotte-Olivier from Strasbourg. We reached out to them, asked them to give us some questions, things they were curious about, and we took those questions, put them together, and today we'll be presenting those to the panelists. And the aim of this is for people to learn about what it takes to do a long-term study from the people who've been doing it. And hopefully we can have this be like, they'll be among the panelists to start, and then after about 45 minutes or so, depending on the flow of the conversation, we will open up questions from the Find community, including those of you on YouTube. Okay, so with that, I'll stop talking and actually start the conversation. And so I think the first question that we got from the students was starting a long-term study. Could you give a piece of advice for an aspiring student hoping to do something to develop a long-term project? And I think I'm just going to pick people at randomish. So I'll start, I'll go with Kay to begin. So Kay, would you mind answering that question about, can you give some advice about starting a long-term project?
Sure. I actually must confess that if I were thinking about doing it today, I would think twice. It's gotten a lot harder than it used to be, but I think to expect the unexpected is a good thing, and you need pretty dramatic persistence in your behavior. So you can't be frustrated and bummed out when a grant doesn't come through or something just doesn't work out. You just have to figure out a way around it.
Okay, great. Uh, Tim, what are your thoughts on that question about advice you'd give someone to start a long-term project?
Well, I think the first thing is that very few people really plan to do long-term projects from the start. Long-term projects are projects which are normally started with a view of 2, 3, 4, possibly 5 years, but not much more, and which are then successful and are then continued. So I think that what people need to do is to plan short-term and think long-term. And as you go through a long-term project, you basically need to take different directions and to ask different questions if you want successive grant applications. But I think my strongest sort of slants of advice would be to pick the right species. Right species is something that's interesting and accessible. It's hugely useful if you can actually catch the animals and weigh them and mark them and so on. It's even more useful if you can regularly get blood samples and fecal samples and so on. And all that really matters in the long term. So accessibility is really important. Two final things. Shared data, don't ring fence. You get huge benefits by other people coming to join you and use your long-term data and bolting on separate studies. And so you don't want to, you've got nothing to lose by sharing data, or you've got very little to lose and huge to gain. And finally, I'd say don't go on too long. Pass it on to someone else, because every time I've moved, I've learned to see aspects of the previous species that I had been working on that I hadn't appreciated. And every time I've moved on, I've enjoyed it hugely, and it's given me a new lease of life.
Great advice. I think that actually, in my mind, that leads to Dustin next, because I think Dustin is not just working with the birds, but also now with not crayfish, shrimps. So Dustin, can you respond to that? We're talking about the advice to starting a long-term study. I think you're on mute, Dustin. Or I can't hear him. Can anyone else hear Dustin? I see he's not on, you're not on mute, Dustin, but I don't hear you.
I can add to you in if that's okay.
Yeah.
Hear me now?
Yeah, I can now.
Okay, sorry,
Good.
I switched microphones. I would just add one thing, I guess. In addition to choosing the right species, you need to choose the right location. The logistics are really important. Whether that's, I think you've got a big representation up here of people who have basically built their own field stations, to people who work in established field stations, to people who have worked in field stations that are have been growing over the course of the project. And I think that the logistics, especially when you're working in a foreign country, are essential, because there's a lot of unforeseen things, and government bureaucracies change and permitting gets harder, and the logistics are just one of the biggest challenges. And so you can simplify those logistics by choosing a location where you're going to work.
Great. Dan, do you want to respond to that or answer the question?
Yeah, I was going to say that logistics are super important. I worked in high elevation Pakistan studying marmots for a while, and that was just crazy. I inherited a long-term study, as you pointed out, and these intergenerational transfers are really important. And there's this core population biology database that we try to keep alive and not change methods. But my challenge was sort of coming up with additional data we would be collecting that would allow us to answer questions that I wasn't even envisioning necessarily, but to come up with ways to create biobanks and databases to allow flexibility moving forward, while still keeping the core demographic data set that's been so rich for the past 60 years going. So think ahead towards questions you're not necessarily intending to ask immediately, but as Tim said, focus on the immediate, but plan for the future.
Christina?
Yeah, I think as Tim said, I don't think most of us started off thinking that these would be long-term projects. At least I didn't. I thought it would be a 3-year PhD project. And if I could go back and do it again, I would probably have paid more attention to demography, because I think where long-term projects really become very rich is when you can say precise things about survival and reproduction. And I would have paid more attention in the beginning to things like, how long do Annies live? You know, this is something we still don't really have a great handle on, despite 15 years of work. They live longer than 15 years. So I think if I were to go back and do it again, I would say, think about demography more than whatever your initial focus was on the project. But I think finding an interesting question and going one question at a time, the long-term aspect takes care of itself if you study the same species for a while. And the only reason to study the same species for a while is if interesting questions keep coming up. So I've always gone one project at a time, and the long-term aspect of it just emerged as a consequence of all those shorter projects.
Does anyone in the panel want to respond to anything else someone said, keeping on this topic of advice to start?
Field stations and marine labs are really good places to work because they can handle a lot of the logistics and provide support, as opposed to having to set up everything yourself. There may be dynamics at field stations and marine labs. There may be limited access to space to work, et cetera, but nonetheless, field station and marine labs can take a lot of the stress out of setting things up yourself.
Okay. Well, thank you all. That's fantastic. So the second question ties into some of the things that came up in your response to the first question, and is, could you talk about one or two logistical challenges you faced, and how do you deal with failures? I think it's a great question. How do we deal with failure? And so with this, I'm going to start with Christina.
Gosh, only one or two logistical challenges. The problem is thinking of which one or two. There are so many. I work at a field station, and so I probably have dealt with fewer than many of the other people here. Logistics, travel, permits, weather, money. Dealing with failure, I think, is, that's life, right? You're just going to fail at a lot of things. And my approach is just to be opportunistic and to do what I can do and to not let the failures knock me down too hard. I'm sure all of us have enormous stacks of rejected grant applications and rejected papers, and you just go back to the drawing board and you take what's useful from it and you just keep going. I honestly have no good advice on this except just be persistent. And if you're enthusiastic and interested in what you're doing, the failures fade into the background, I think.
Okay, great. Dustin.
One of the main areas that I study is how environmental variation shapes social behavior. And what that means is we work in a very unpredictable environment, and that puts a lot of stress on timelines and the ability to get work done. So what we do is not always compatible with the timeline of a grant funding, because the weather may not cooperate for a year or two, and birds may not really breed for much of that time. And so it's hard to get our samples or do our experiments. And so, and then the thing that stresses me the most out is getting the permits to get the samples home, and then making sure those samples get home, without getting lost on an airplane or a shipper or whatever. So that's the most uncertainty that I deal with, I think. In terms of failure, I don't think failure is any different to anybody working on a long-term system as to anybody working on any system. I think maybe there's less failure in a long-term system because you're always generating data. And so even if an experiment doesn't work, you've got your long-term reproductive success or demographic data sets to fall back on. So for example, when, things in the pandemic precluded some of my students from doing, the experiments or things they wanted to do for their thesis, they can fall back on the long-term data set to ask, related questions using that. So, the benefit of a long-term system is that it's always generating a rich data set that you can use on top of the things that you might be doing at a specific time point to get funding or to answer a really interesting question.
Great. Kay.
Well, for us, we don't have an organized field station. We've had to basically create that for ourselves. And one of our biggest logistical hassles has been finding a place where you're actually in the shade so that the blazing equatorial sun doesn't cook you all day, and next to water. And we have one of our biggest logistical challenges is flooding. So we've had 3 once in a century floods since 1998. And each time they cost a ton of money and were an enormous hassle to replace all the things that got damaged and lost there. And for us, the other big logistical hassle is keeping your cars going, because you have to study large carnivores from vehicles generally. And so boy, loud dog, sorry. I'll just shut up then.
Oh, it's all right. Dogs are fun.
Okay, well, I'm sorry. They're really, they're
okay.
really loud. But yeah, we were originally trying to do all our own car repairs, and we'd be lying under a Land Cruiser, and some critical nut or bolt would fly off into the grass, outside of the vehicle, and then you're just screwed because you don't have another one. So anyway, those kind of problems were a pain in the neck for a long time, and I finally came to the conclusion: much better off paying somebody else to do the car repairs than trying to do it myself. I am not a mechanic.
I'm trying to remember who I've called on here. Tim?
Well, I mean, I think the first thing is to realize that we all fail and that we all get grant applications rejected and so on. As time goes on with the larger projects, things get easier because you start to develop multiple funding channels with different people, which can keep the thing going. But that's really at a considerably later stage. I think the best advice that I'd want to give on people, and this is learn to write, and learn to write really synthetically, really clearly, and really shortly. Not many people can do it. And it's absolutely crucial to write really clear abstracts for your grants and short papers. Very few people can do that well. Keep working on it. That's what makes you good at getting grant applications.
Excellent. I think, did I get everyone on that question?
No,
Go ahead, Dan.
So, I mean, sort of alluding to what Dustin was saying, you really can't plan how many animals you're going to have in a given year. And you can plan this great, we study marmots hibernate. You get there, everyone's dead because they didn't make it through the winter. So if you have an experiment planned, that causes problems, which sort of means that many data are collected over many years. And what I find really interesting and as a challenge is that, different epochs of data lead to different answers, and that's life. And that's kind of cool. And when you get long-term studies, you're really then able to not just ask main effects, but ask interactions and try to understand the context of whatever you're looking at better. Doing experiments over a couple of years becomes more problematic if things are varying, which they are in many systems. Susan Perry pointed out about databases, and I'll say that we're on our third incantation of a database now. And maybe this is working a little better, maybe not. But I think thinking about data management has for us has led to a number of failures and rebirths and is an ongoing challenge.
Do folks the 5 of you want to respond to anything someone said or follow up? Okay, not, I can go to the next question. So this question may have been answered already, but I think still worth following up on. It says, How have you stayed focused on the main project and avoid being distracted by other possible smaller ones that may seem quicker and more exciting than the long-term study? So I'll start with Tim on this one.
Get distracted. Don't. So often, the most interesting things you find are not the things you set out to, not the questions you set out to answer. So you obviously, so it's not really that issue. You don't consciously have to discipline yourself to keep going on the central questions. If those are important and those are still interesting, those stay with you. But take advantage of what you find out in the meanwhile, and be quite prepared to be distracted and to go down side channels. We all make a big thing, and we all set up grants to say, these are the questions we're going to answer. This is why they're important. This is what we're going to do, and this is what we're going to show. But actually, when one writes the grant account at the end, so 5 years later, commonly the most interesting things you found, as I say, were not the things that you set out to find. Sad fact of life.
Okay, what do you think?
I completely agree with everything Tim just said. And I think, chance does favor the prepared mind. So as Tim said, if you're actually just open-minded enough to see something interesting as it comes up, then it is worth turning your attention to that. And, we usually now these days have multiple smaller projects going on within the larger one. And I don't feel in any way that it impedes our progress. We just have to be careful that we're not stepping on one another's toes as we divide the labor.
Dan.
I follow shinies. So I'm what everything Tim and Kay said in terms of the long-term data and the long-term project is one thing, be serendipitous there. But I study lots of other things as well. And I find that by studying lots of other things, often in very short focused studies, it gives me insights that I can bring back, tools, techniques, approaches that I can bring back to the long-term studies. So I by having my fingers in lots of pots, it's just sort of this mind exercise. So I think, if you can handle it, study lots of things.
Great. Christina.
Yeah, I completely agree. Being distracted is the fun of it. And without the shorter projects or the more defined projects, then the long-term data collection, I think, grows out of those shorter projects in a large sense. Students have to do PhDs in a reasonable amount of time. Summer projects with undergraduate students or something, might only have a few months. Those distractions are what make it fun. I also think that having more than one project going at a time is one of the great fail-safes against failure, right? It's one of the things that makes it easier to keep working on the same study if you can switch from one question to another relatively easily. And looking at different behaviors within the same species can be really powerful, because you can ask questions about one thing, but it's influenced by all of the rich data you have looked at in other contexts. So be distracted.
Dustin.
I think it's always good to have a few irons in the fire and take some risks and have some less risky projects. And if the risky ones look like they're going to hit, you can focus more of your energy on those at a given time. And if not, you've always got your sort of fallback. And that can be different questions within the same system, or that can be multiple systems, right? So I think a lot of us up here, some of us up here have multiple study systems, and some of us have one study system and attack that study system in different ways. And so there's different strategies that you can use, but you can't put all your investment in one. And I think a long-term study, I think as others have said, nobody set out to have a long-term study. They set out with a question, and then that led to another question and another question. And before you know it, you've studied your system for a long time, and you've been able to ask a lot of questions. And so I think one of the interesting questions maybe we might want to ask is, at what point do you move on from a long-term study system? You can always learn something, right? But there might be diminishing returns, and your investment might be better on another set of questions in another system, right? Tim's sort of done that, I think, given his 3 long-term systems, he's moved on to progressively different systems, right? And, my advisor, one of my advisors, Steve Emlin, did that also. He moved on from BEATers to Chicanas. And at what point is the time you leave your long-term study system, either pass it on to somebody else who has new ideas, or start asking different questions? I don't have an answer to that.
I think there's an answer to that. I think you leave your system when you start to get bored with it. I think I mean, I've certainly discovered when I've got to a point where I felt that I was answering smaller and smaller questions, and the thing didn't have the same excitement for me, then it was time to move on. And I think it's not, I don't think that necessarily comes for some time, but I think that does come eventually. And then the ideal is to move it on to someone else who'll take a different line. So that my experience with that was that I left really the Red Deer and the Sophie sheep data to Josephine Pemberton and Lerska Crook, who took them both in a genetic line, which is marvelous and is very exciting, but isn't my expertise or interest. But as far as I'm concerned, it's hugely rewarding because I remain sort of somewhat involved in both of those and interested in the questions. And it's great to see that going ahead. So I think the ideal situation is, as I say, you pass them on to someone who wants that background, but has a new direction to take them in.
Any other follow-up from folks on the panel, or? Okay. So we have one more question that was sent to us by the students, and then we can open up to the fine community. And I think this is the big one. How have you funded your project, and what have been the selling points for doing so? That's the big question. How do you keep it going? So I'll start with, I haven't called on Dustin first yet. So go ahead, Dustin.
So I started my project as a graduate student, and I was probably able to keep it productive as a graduate student through relatively small grants, but that wasn't really enough. What did it was I had a fellowship and I was allowed to go in absentia, and the university let me use the tuition money as research money. So that was a good chunk of money. I don't know, probably as a grad student, maybe $60,000 to $100,000 that way over 5 years, something like that. And then now I funded it as a postdoc. I sort of shut it down, bare bones, worked on another system and kept it going with a little bit of personal funding and a little bit of research money. And then I got a job and I had startup funds and then NSF funds to keep it going. But I'm at the end of funding now, and I need to decide what the next grant will be, or it'll be the end and I move on to another system because I have other systems too. So as Tim said, maybe when you're less excited. My next grant proposals that I'm most excited about are in other systems, and so those will be the next proposals that I put in. And for my long-term system, I can keep it going for a good chunk of time because it's not that expensive compared to some of the lab work that we do. And then we'll see. So maybe another 5 years, and then we'll see after that.
Dan.
I lose sleep over funding. I've always funded my research with personal money. I'm not that successful at getting big grants. I get great students and help them get fellowships, which offset costs that way. I empower my students and help them earn their own money to offset costs. I rely on volunteers. The lab has a REU program, a research experiences for undergrad program that I get students sort of for educational program, which is invaluable, good students. I was chair for 7 years to sort of build up a war chest of, discretionary funds, which I'm still using. I do anything I can to get money, and I'm running out of money. I mean, we run out of money in the middle of the next field season. So we'll see what happens. So I lose sleep over funding.
Okay. Okay.
I'm not losing any sleep over funding any longer. We've actually had a lot of different sources fund the hyena work in Kenya. Originally, when I first joined the faculty at Michigan State, I got a couple of those awards that only go to new faculty members. And that was hugely helpful in terms of setting things up in a way that I could be back in the States for a lot of the year and have people collecting the data even when I wasn't there. NSF has supported us continuously every day since 1987. And now I have a cohort of 5 former grad students, all of whom are off doing postdocs. They want to take over the Hyena Project as a collaborative effort. And so I think between the 5 of them, hopefully they'll be able to keep the project going.
Christina?
Yeah, gosh, all of the above. Beg, borrow, and steal. I know few people who've managed to do it without dipping into personal money at some point. I certainly did. My story is more similar to Dustin's. I started it with graduate student funding, kept it going through postdoc fellowships. There was one summer where I paid most of my own research expenses, but fieldwork is pretty cheap. And if you're doing the work yourself, it's not that expensive. What gets really expensive is when you have to hire a lot of people. And then that's where I lose sleep, because then you need to pay their salaries and help them get jobs after they stop working. Someone's asking, when people say personal money, are they referring to the money they receive as wages? Yeah, it's whatever is in your personal bank account. That's what I that's what I consider personal money. And so yeah, and the hardest summer was between when I finished my graduate work and when I started my postdoc, because I really didn't have money to cover anything, and I was paying for my own health insurance, and I didn't have any assistance. I just did it all myself. But I felt like it was worth it because I knew that I wanted to keep working on the study system. And I lose sleep over grants as well, because no matter, NSF grants are time limited. It's only a few years, and I never feel that the next one is guaranteed by any means. So it's been mostly stringing lots of small things together and hoping for a big windfall every few years.
Tim?
I think I think almost all the things I've done have been relatively expensive because they've involved animals in areas where we've had to take on permanent staff and vehicles and so on. I think that it's always with difficulty. With the Red Deer study, my involvement with the study started as a 2-year postdoc. And then I managed to follow this with 10 successive 3-year grants, each exploring a different angle. And now Josephine and Lerska have taken this, and they've got another 5 or 6 grants. So the Red Deer study, as an example, has been running now for nearly 50 years, and it's been continuous on that basis. I think that the main advice I'd give there is, as I say, get very good at writing. And don't for a moment believe that although there's a big stochastic element, don't believe for a moment that your probability of getting funds depends on the number of applications you put in. Every application you put in is liable to be competing with around 10 others. You've got to make sure it's the best. So I think my advice would be just to work very, very hard on grant applications, giving the referees exactly what they want and making them just as clear and exciting as possible. And I regularly discourage my postdocs and students from doing grant applications rapidly, from trying to apply to lots of sources, or from doing last minute grant applications. Think way ahead and deal with it very carefully, because every successful grant application has almost certainly been in competition with a substantial number of other very good applications too.
Okay, so I think that was the last question that the students sent to us. It's an amazing amount of advice and great advice. So what I'd like to do is now open up the conversation to other people. So if you have questions, for those of you who are new here, please put a question mark in the chat and I will direct the question to the panel. When you come on, you can ask the panel in general, or you could direct it to a specific individual, whatever you feel most comfortable doing. And if you're on YouTube, I'll be keeping an eye on that and I'll relay your question to the panel. And I've already seen 4 question marks jump in pretty quick, so I'm just going to get started on this. The first is, I'm going to go with the first student in the queue. And sorry, Eduardo, and that is Chyanne.
Hi, Chyanne from the University of Tennessee at Chattanooga. I was just wondering, because one of the questions I had before was if you don't get funding, and a lot of you have said to use personal funding. So I guess at what point do you know if you're using your personal funds? When should you stop that study, or how do you know when you're just not getting funding? Or what if you don't have the personal funds to do it? Then you just stop the study, or are there other things you can do?
Tony said it's a privilege to, be able to use personal funds, and he's right. I don't know how to answer that. If you can swing it, swing it. If it's worth it to you. I mean, I'm passionate about what I do. And I'm, I may be overly optimistic about what we can achieve. So, I just keep trying, hitting different angles. So I've been able to cobble it together, but I mean, also it involves volunteers. And some people believe very strongly that everybody should be paid and there should be no volunteers in our field. And, I wouldn't be able to do this without volunteers. And I try to empower my volunteers and set them up to win by being co-authors or often first authors on projects. So I have a long track record of bringing people in who are giving me labor, and I'm giving them data and intellectual input and mentoring and advice, and they're getting papers out of their time. That works for some people and not others. I don't know what you do with that. I understand the equity issues associated with that.
Anyone else on the panel? Okay. So Eduardo, why don't you ask your question, please?
Thank you, everyone. I want to follow up. Many of you made the comments of failure being part of our lives, and down you just finished talking about, if I don't get a grant, I try again. And I wonder if you could, some of you could comment quickly. We all teach and are aware of the problems of positive data, positive instances of things. And what happens to many of our students and young scholars is that they only hear about the grants we get. A couple of years ago, because of an application, I decided to really quantify and look at the number of grants that I had submitted, because I think it gives them a better sense of what it takes to have a long-term project. So could you, I mean, from the top of your head, to quantify a little bit what you've been talking about, that yes, get used to failure. And if I don't get a grant, I don't pull out the pending one, I write 3 more, keeping in mind what Tim was saying, that always quality first. But could you comment on what's your guess of how, I mean, how many grants does it take? How many proposals has it taken to you to get one? So that they understand that, no, we're not always successful in our applications.
I'll go answer that. In my own experience, it's about, 50-50. It is now, they're funding at NSF such a tiny fraction of the proposals submitted that there's a lot of great proposals that are getting turned down always. And so that's going to be a fact of life, I'm afraid.
I think Tim said it best. You have to be good at writing grants. It's a skill and it's an art, right? Like, so if Kay's 50% of her grants are funded, she's well above the funding rates at NSF, right? I'd say mine are about 30 to 40%. So not bad, but not as good, right? And so, but it takes practice. It's like writing a paper. You get better at writing papers the more you write. You get better at writing grant proposals. And there's an art, and I wouldn't say there's a formula, but because there's multiple ways to do it. But there's the people that have had continuous funding for 30, 40, 50 years are good at writing grants, and there's a reason they have continuous funding. I find the biggest challenge now is to find time to write the grants between writing the papers and doing all the other stuff. So.
I'm just going to follow up on that, Dustin, talking about time. How long do you invest in a grant proposal, I should say?
It takes me to write an NSF proposal, maybe 3 or 4 weeks of only really working on that in the summer.
Takes me longer.
It takes me upwards of 3 months to write a good one. And I'm far below in the percentage-wise funding than both of you. Okay. Anyone else want to follow up on that?
I think it takes a long time. I'd agree with you, Lauren. It takes me somewhere between 2 and 4 months. But I'd normally reckon to span that over a 6-month period. So I'd start writing a grant application 6 months before it was due to go in. And I think the only bit of advice I'd give to anyone is just to think through to the grant committee. Think through to the member of the grant committee that has 20, 30, 40 applications that they've got to read through and assimilate. And if realize that to catch that you've got to catch their attention straight away. So if I read a grant and I don't know by the time I've read the page what direction the person is going in, I suspect that the person isn't too clear about that themselves. So give the reader what they need to assess it as fast as you can, and give them it clearly and give them it in an interesting fashion, and really work on that. Look at nature or science papers and look at their abstracts to see how they are written and worded and crafted to get the most meaning out of the smallest number of words. Strip out every word you can and keep it just as simple as possible, and keep the logic running in a straight direction, and be very careful of the wandering clauses at the front of sentences that qualify it, and all sorts of aspects of writing that just make it much harder for someone to actually understand your meaning and you understand the direction of your argument. So try and make your application just run straight through like an express train from the beginning to the end.
I agree with Tim actually in terms of the timeline, because I'd say it takes me about 6 months just to get a grant proposal submitted. And as Tim said, not all of that is writing, but it pays, I think, to be able to put a proposal on a shelf and come back after 2 or 3 weeks and see it with fresh eyes. That really helps.
I think the bigger challenge for me is actually not the writing, it's hitting the sweet spot for things like an NSF proposal between doing a project that's feasible and that you can show you are able to do, because NSF likes a lot of preliminary data, and proposing something that's still new and exciting enough that it is novel enough to be funded. And now I don't know how I would write an NSF proposal on something that wasn't on my long-term study system, because I would actually really like to start new study systems, and it's very hard because without any preliminary data, NSF probably will not fund it. So the writing is a real challenge, and the writing is the artistry of the writing I really enjoy, but that's not the hardest part for me. The hardest part for me is figuring out what is the right balance of feasibility and novelty for a proposal like for NSF. And NSF is very picky about getting that balance right.
And that balance differs between different granting agencies, I think so in our world, the British research councils tend to be rather picky, like NSF, whereas the European research councils want big ideas and new directions. So I think that one doesn't want to think that all the bodies require the same sort of grant application. You've actually got to try and get a feeling of what they're funding and what they want.
Great. So I'm going to go on to the next question, and that comes from Adriana.
Hi, Adriana Maldonado from Universidad de Rosario, Colombia. First, I want to thank you all for sharing all your experience. It's really great to hear from you, like how it's done. And also I want to make sure to tell everyone that the question I'm going to ask comes from one of my students. He's an undergrad student, so it's kind of a exciting question for him to ask. He wants to know, what does intrigues you the most or passionate the most of your study system that makes you keep it interested and engaged for studying it for a long time?
I think all of us study social behavior, and it's sort of like a soap opera out there, figuring out, who survived, who's having fights with whom, who's having sex with whom. So the soap opera nature of it makes it a story, and we as humans are all into stories. Of course, the science is fun, but the soap opera makes it enjoyable.
Anyone else?
I think the other thing that really motivates is when you start to get a feeling that you're discovering something or putting something together that generates a general pattern that explains lots of other things, not only with your own species but with other species too. And when you start to think you're on the beginning of something larger and more general than just the specifics in your particular species in your particular area. And when a line of research starts to do that, it really becomes tremendously exciting and very rewarding.
Anyone else want to respond? Or okay. So I'm going to go to the next question, and that comes from David Wood.
Hi, I'm David Wood. I'm a third-year graduate student at Yale, working with Eduardo. I really appreciate this roundtable that we're having. It's really nice to get a more broad feel for all of you other researchers, how you do stuff, as opposed to just having the sample of Eduardo to talk to. I'm thinking that it's probably more likely in my career that I'll take over a field site than create a new one. And it seems like there's a huge number of very particular skills that you need to have to manage a long-term field site. And I'm wondering how I should triage those skills, which stuff I need to learn now, which stuff I can kind of learn on the job, and how can that transfer of PI-ship, I suppose, of the long-term project, how can that go smoothly?
Ken Armitage generously transferred the Marmot project to me when I was coming back to the US. And, we overlapped a bit. And he was happy to see new questions and new ideas. And the skills are, if you've worked the system, then you sort of know how to do it. If you're coming into a new system that you haven't worked, you probably should plan to overlap with the person or people that are running a project. But if you're inheriting a system that you've already been working in, then you sort of know what you need to know. Should you be fortunate enough to keep the funding coming in.
Maybe I could clarify. Sorry, I think I'm more curious about like the managerial skills. Like, is it more important to learn the bureaucracy of the country that you'll be working with, or focus on the social relationships with the people that you'll need to sign these permits, or figure out how to work within your own university to get like undergrads or something to this field site to boost the number of people working?
I think the social dynamics of your team are essential, because without the people you're working with closely, nothing will happen. So figuring out how to mentor and support and collaborate with people is going to be the kernel of the research success. And then I would say I've had to deal with permits, and I still deal with permits in other countries. Each of those is its own challenge or set of challenges, which is not necessarily a fixed target. So, figuring out how to do that in the context of where you're working is going to be important.
I think the answer to your question is all of the above. We've been in here 55 minutes and I've seen emails come in from my lawyers talking about IP for a grant that we need to sign. I've got an email from a field assistant whose family member just passed away and we're dealing with logistics there. I've got emails from another collaborator talking about sample ownership and stuff like that, right? Like these are things that, if you're doing the science, you never see, but just in 1 hour, and something came in about some permit issues that I'm having in Kenya too, right? So in like 1 hour, I have to deal with all of these logistical things that'll take me the next hour when I get back, and they're not what I want to be focusing on. I'd rather be spending that hour reading papers for a grant proposal that I need to write in a few months, right? So it only takes me less time to write the proposal, but it takes me like 6 or 8 months to think about what I'm going to write and read. And then when I sit down, I can write it, but I'm like, I need time to think. And, running a project means all of the logistical chaos that you don't think about and sometimes don't see. So I don't know that you need to learn those skills. I mean, the skill that you need to learn is to just get shit done. And you have to be able to multitask, and you have to be able to deal with all the things that you don't want to deal with so that you can spend the time reading, writing, collecting data, and doing the stuff that you do want to deal with. And I think that's sometimes what students don't see behind the scenes that the people running the projects don't deal with. And then as you get to that stage, you just have to be ready to deal with that stuff.
Yeah. I think the managerial skills and things like that, I don't think you learn those. I think they're thrust upon you. If I were looking for someone to take over my project, the only deal breaker would be like, are they really excited by the research? Everything else will follow, I think, and it's a headache. All as Dustin listed, there's so many headaches that you have to deal with. But I don't know that planning for the headaches is necessarily the right way to go. If I had planned for the headaches, I wouldn't have gone into the business,
Susan Perry had a good point in the chat there, saying that to be able to actually organize your data in a way that's going to make analysis subsequently easy is a very good thing. And I think we've all had to learn that we did at least certain things the wrong way at the outset.
David, I would add is I agree with Dustin and all of the above times 10. And then working with people is another big thing. Being able to work with other individuals and managing your own emotions and their emotions. And if you work in another country dealing with cultural differences, that's been, I think, being able to just do that effectively, it will make for a much more positive experience. Great question. So now I have a question from Karsten. It's actually in the chat. He asked the question, how did the funding situation for long-term studies change over the decades? And what do you predict for the future?
I'll take a stab at it. I think if anything, it's actually gotten easier because I think, when you're at that stage where you just finished your first dissertation length project and now a new question has arisen that you're interested to pursue, you don't have that big database that you can point to yet. So there it got trickier. But I do think that at least people at NSF and certain other funding agencies now they have come to appreciate the power of these long-term studies when you can actually assess fitness in relation to all kinds of other things that happen in the animal's life.
I think that's right. I think I would have said too that I think if anything, things are easier, though it depends on the timescale you're looking at. It's worth, I think, just casting back to the people who sort of started field studies, people like Tinberg and Lack and the major figures in ornithology who were working in the 50s and 60s. And they were working with virtually no money. The grants that they were getting were tiny. They were grants that supported small amounts of field equipment. They didn't have jobs on them or anything like that. So I think today actually at the far end of that. And I'm not saying recently it's got easier, but I think that today we're actually in a very fortunate situation where our grants are considered within the same funding parcels as people working in other areas of science who immediately would expect much larger bulks of money. We are now able to get grants with multiple jobs on them and substantial amounts of facilities and analytical procedures and so on. So I think that the potential today is absolutely there. And I think that the granting bodies, many of them do recognize the benefits of the long-term work and the benefits of studies that can be based on large samples of individual life histories with biological information attached. So I don't think that the situation has got much harder. It may have got harder recently. So I mean, in the last decade, what's happened with funding and how, in particular in the States, my impression is that things have got pretty tough for a variety of political reasons rather than scientific or scientific organizational reasons. But I think in the very long run, things have got progressively better.
I'm going to push back against that. I think maybe while we realize and recognize the value of long-term studies, I don't think NSF at least is putting their money where their mouth is. The long-term LTREB, long-term research in environmental biology program, has about $4 million a year budget that they probably double. Put that into perspective of how much baseball player makes. Baseball players are making tens of millions of dollars a year. The pay line for the worst team in baseball is substantially more than what NSF allocates to long-term research. So while they may recognize the value of long-term research, I wrote an essay on this. While they may recognize the value of long-term research, they're not really recognizing the value of long-term research. So I think that's something that, and Tim's been a leader in sort of, proselytizing the value of long-term research. I try to proselytize the value of long-term research. I think we all do. And I think there is a lot to proselytize. I think it should be an easy sell, but I think we have to up our lobbying skills to see concrete action in this regard, in terms of saying that we value long-term research because of the training. No one's talked about the training opportunities. One of the values of our study is we train a ton of people and they get great training and they go on and do amazing things. So there are many values of long-term research above and beyond simply the scientific merit of it, in terms of many, many broader impacts, including training the next generation of scientists. So I think that I think we all have a job to convince funding bodies to make it easier for long-term studies to get supported.
I think I would just add that I think in the grand scheme of things, the actual long-term research itself is relatively cheap. The things that cost money are the salaries, and they just go up and up and up. And that's what keeps me up at night. I mean, I guess not the grants, but paying the people that have been on my projects for 10, 15, 20 years, right? I need to raise their salaries to pay them year round. But the actual cost of doing research on the ground for me is quite low. There's still lots of vehicles and vehicle repairs and permits and flights and stuff, but it's the people that cost a lot. And then it's the type of science that we do on top of that now, the genetics and stuff like that costs a fortune. But that's the stuff that's more fundable, at least in the US, right? And can get you the bigger grants that can pay for that relatively cheap field work and that expensive lab work and those expensive salaries.
Study a hibernating species, then you only have to study them for half the year.
I'm going to go to the next question. That comes from, is it Sophia?
Hi, I'm Sophia so I recently defended my PhD at the German Primate Center. And first of all, thank you so much for sharing your experience. It's really encouraging and really helpful. So I actually have two questions. And the first one is like an extension of what has been discussed in the beginning. So if you could go back to the beginning, when you didn't know yet that the site would be long-term in the end, what would you pay special attention to? So Christina mentioned demography, and then Susan mentioned databases. Is there anything else that we should pay attention to from the beginning? And then my second question was about field assistance. So how necessary it is to have long-term field assistance to run a long-term field site. So is it really important to have the assistants who would work for multiple years over multiple projects? Or is it okay is it doable if you have several assistants that only work for specific projects? So yeah, that are the questions.
Can I just address her last question first? In our particular situation, anybody who works with the hyenas has to learn their individual identities, or there's really not anything interesting that you can do at all. So that's the hardest part for almost everyone, and it wouldn't work at all to have some people pop in for a short-term project. These people have spent years looking at these animals, and they can ID them from hundreds of yards away now. They're really good. So, that's just a logistical constraint that would make it hard to have field assistants pop in and out. But then there are the shorter term things where that might work well.
So I work in a field station, and I work with a bunch of people who study behavior, but also ecology. And I think there's different strategies that people use, and it might vary based on if you're studying long-term, like social behavior versus ecology. So I've noticed that the ecologists often have, field assistants that add continuity to the project, but they bring in usually American or European field technicians for a year that sort of organize and run things and the logistics. And that may work if you're going out and doing a sampling plan and you're not so driven by the behavior of the animals. I've relied on the same field assistant since the beginning, 21 plus years. He was 18 when he started, and now he's in 40s, and the project would not exist without him, because he provides the continuity, because my birds can breed any month of the year. And there needs to be someone on the ground who knows what they're doing, because I can't be there most of the time, right? And so for me, having a local assistant whose life is the project is critical. And without him, that project would probably be no more. And so I think it depends on the system that you have. If you have a hibernating system like Dan, you don't need that necessarily, because when the snow melt's going to come for the most part. But we can't do that.
I think that method creep is really important to guard against, and having continuity between years is essential. I learned from Susan Perry. I was writing my own protocols, but she has amazing protocols that she's written up for the capuchins, guidelines on how to study, how to observe, documenting plans and updating them and discussing them, while still ensuring that the methods that you're using aren't creeping is a challenge, particularly for long-term studies. So we're always writing protocols and looking at protocols and trying to explain them better while not changing what we're doing, and having consistency across years helps with that.
Okay, if we've covered that, I'll move on to the next question.
Oop. I think Lauren is frozen, eh?
We lost Lauren. Lauren down.
Well, we can take the next question, which comes from your email address is listed as Chesnier1 UCLA. If you want to introduce yourself and go ahead.
Actually, I had a question that I had written in, and maybe I should just say it out loud.
Oh, I'm sorry. You're right. You're right, Andy. You're right, Andy. Yes, your question is next. I'm sorry. I didn't see the question mark. We asked for the question mark and I missed it. Go ahead, please.
Oh, yeah. Okay. Right. So this was actually one that I know that for many of you is difficult, but could be something of interest for other people just starting their projects, is how about starting a long-term project like close to campus, thus making all the logistics and expenses for that matter much easier to handle. which for those of you that are in big cities might mean doing urban behavioral ecology. But it might actually mean that all of this is easier if you are, in fact, at a position at a smaller school with nature that is within a 1 or 2 hour drive or even closer. And I'll just add that when I was in Kentucky, my field site was a half-hour drive away. And in Davis, my field site is half an hour drive away, making it a lot easier to do at least some of the things that you guys do. But, you know, have any of you done that, or what's your thoughts on that?
Great idea.
Yeah, Andy, we're actually doing that now because of the pandemic. So we couldn't go to Panama.
Yeah.
And so we actually started a local project, which I'm very excited about, on Carolina Wrens. And if we get funding for 3 years, maybe it'll turn into 6 years and 9 years and 12 years, and then maybe it'll be a long-term project. I think that's how these things get started. I think there are huge advantages of having a local field project. It's something I've wanted to start for a really long time. And I think it might be a silver lining of the pandemic is that it forced me to do it.
Andy, I think it comes down to what you want to ask. So I was co-advised in grad school, and one of my advisors suggested pick an organism that interests you, go watch it, and you'll find a bunch of questions that you can answer. Another advisor was more come up with the questions you want to ask and find the system to fit that, right? And so if you're the latter, then it might not work to be local. If your goal is to come up with something that makes the logistics easy and that you can do on a cheaper budget, then finding something within the local distance. You know, personally, I'm a question-driven scientist, and we find the system to meet our questions, and that means we work, you know, all over the world and sometimes locally. We tried to set up a local system and it crashed and burned a few years ago just on European starlings, but we couldn't get them to nest in boxes, which seems crazy because they're European starlings. Wow. But it's just too woody around New York. So I think it depends on how you want to approach the problem and whether you want to be question driven and then find the system to fit, or you want to find a system and then find the questions in the system.
And I don't know that they're entirely mutually exclusive either. I mean, you know, the could have been actually really fascinating if they had been accessible, which goes back to Tim's original point about, you know, it's important to study something you can study. I think that I wouldn't have been able to study communal nesting locally, but as my interests have broadened, I see more and more possibilities, and not all of them are abroad.
Maybe we can go to the next question now. Yes, it's your turn. I see you. If you can introduce yourself, Chase Near 1 at UCLA.
Hello, everyone. My name is Chase. I'm a PhD student at UCLA in the Blumstein lab. My question has to do with the fact that, like, in a long-term study, you're obviously studying these animals over a long period of time, but in what sense do you have to account for the fact that they also might be studying you and observing you over this time? Is habituation something that you account for or try to avoid, and what's your relationship to the kind of intimacies that might occur between you and your system over many years?
We're driving around in big cars, and so we have to be very careful not to drive over animals. But it's, just something we have to do.
It's obviously difficult to be sure that that animals are behaving the same when you're not there as when you are there, and there are actually practical difficulties about that. My straightforward reaction on that is that animals that are scared of you or alarmed at you, are much more likely to be affected by your presence than animals that are dead bored with you. And if, as I do and have always done, you basically rely on habituation in order to collect the information, which is very, very common for mammal studies in particular, then you're going to habituate. And what you want to do is to habituate really thoroughly. And the story I always tell with meerkats, when we can work absolutely right close to meerkats so that they're at our feet. And if you sit down, they'll lean on you and so on. But when you're close to them, it's absolutely clear that they're more interested in what's going on behind you than in you. And you see that very clearly, and it's extremely reassuring. So I always say with meerkats, it's very like being in a drinks party where you're talking to someone who doesn't really want to talk to you, but is much more interested in who's walking in at the door. And that's very much the situation with meerkats. They're dead bored with us. You know, they've known us since they've known humans generally, and as our type of humans in particular, from the first time they came blinking into the light of day. They're not bothered. Their reaction to us is the same as the reactions of rabbits who have been brought up in a field with sheep to sheep. They don't want to be trodden on, but they're really just not bothered. And I mean, it's difficult to show that the animals behave similarly when you're not there, but you very strongly get that impression. I think the most important thing really is that if you start using food rewards, as many of us would do, and we did, it's seriously important to avoid a situation where the animals are continuously begging for food resources from you, so that you have to be careful to condition any gifts, any use of food like that to particular things. So you have to give them a particular signal, which you don't give at any other time, and then you can break them of any habit like that.
So I am helping Lauren, who I think you're here, but he's telling me that he's lost all of his chatting window and all the text. So I'm gonna help with the questions. It's already 12:15. I cannot emphasize enough how thankful we are to the panelists. And we've talked about this before. I would like to suggest that those who need to go, please do. Those who can afford it. I mean, this is really let's hope it is not once in a lifetime opportunity, but the discussion we've had so far, it's absolutely remarkable and so useful that in my mind, I'm thinking to suggest to my co-organizers that how do we get a sequel to this sometime in the near future. So please, as you need to, feel free to leave us for some of that boring stuff that you need to do to keep your long-term projects going. Those who can stay, we have so many more questions from our young scholars who are going to carry the torch for us, that if we can, I'd like to make sure we address them all. So along those lines, we have a question from Tasha Ostuzen. She's a PhD student. She tells me that she tells me that it's going to write the question. She's a PhD student at the University of Witwatersrand in South Africa. After listening to how long it takes writing a grant proposal, how do you improve your time management skills to get around to both new research and publishing old research, on top of writing proposals and attending all the other things related to being a researcher? Any tips or tricks for young researchers? And who wants to take that one? Now you're answering almost as a parent, it sounds.
You learn to write really fast. You write with very few drafts. And you stay late. At least that's my that's my tip.
Yeah, my emails are literally typos.
Yeah.
I never have time to spend much time on emails. But I think you need to also prioritize, and certain things have deadlines, and those have to be done before the things that don't have deadlines, and certain things then slip to the end. Like I owe some people some commentary papers that are 2 years old and they still want them, and there's no deadline, and so I don't know how long that's going to last. But you just have to prioritize and focus.
The next question, please. You can really help me because I try to stay focused. I don't multitask, which means that I'd rather have you type a question mark and ask the question than write 3 paragraphs where I need to sort and try to find the question mark. So the next question is from Christophe Bousquet. Please, Christophe.
Hello, so I'm Christophe, and I did my PhD on meerkats, the Calgary Meerkat project a while ago, and before that I also... Do you hear me well, actually? No, you don't hear me.
Yeah, we hear you.
Yes, we do.
We can hear you.
All right, so and before that I went to French Guiana to work on leatherback turtles, and then I went on Mandarte Island for 2 seasons on song sparrows. So basically I was really been interested by ecology and behavior in on the field sites, and what I was really always like saddened about is the fact that it's extremely difficult to get funding. And by the way, I also wanted, like Eduardo, to say that it was a great discussion. And I always thought that it's very weird because they give so much they give so much this value, this field size, they have so much value for society at large, and it's extremely difficult to get them going. And when I discuss with people from the society, they are not aware that it's so difficult to get funding for these study sites, and they are always surprised how difficult it is. So my question is, do you think we will always have to rely on grant funding applications to run these long-term studies, or would it be possible, like Dan said before, that it could be possible to use, for example, more lobbying and things like that, to have more like political power, to have some like a reserve of workers? I know many people who would be interested to do this kind of job and could like go from field stations to field station to be paid by the public, and then afterwards the researcher could more focus on writing grants on their scientific value than on trying to find money to fund the salaries for their employees at the field site. A bit like, for example, for firemen or whatever.
I suppose I think that's a nice idea, but I think it's pretty unlikely that societies are going to fund people just in our particular line of research. I mean, there is a system set up for funding science. We benefit hugely from that because it provides us with access to quite large lumps of money. I think to hope that one might persuade society to basically change round and fund wandering or moving field workers of the kind you suggest. I don't see that that's very likely. I think we have a system where there are funds available, and I think that the advice to give anyone is to say, get good at extracting them. They're not, don't, what I always tell my people is don't feel that anyone owes you a grant. You're in a really unusual situation that there are people who give away these big blocks of money for some reason, and you have a chance of getting at them. And so be a bit piratical, get organized to maximize your chances of snaffling a grant. I think that has a better chance of success than hoping to change society, to persuade society to actually change the whole basis. Having said that, I can think of some people who are funded by private trusts or grants to do particular things that trust or that person is particularly interested in. But if you go down that line, you are very dependent on the person who's giving you the money. So if you fall out of favor with them, you're in problems.
Thanks.
So we have a question from Delphine Demour, who is telling me that she cannot really pose it herself. She's saying that we often hear advice to study multiple systems, join several labs to focus on the questions rather than on the system. Yet some of us, including myself, have found that the study system they love to study, and that is also great to answer questions of interest. it sounds like many of you started focusing on one species early on. So would you say that is a harder path to follow? You have her question in the chat. If my reading of it made it confusing. It sounds like many of you started focusing on one species early on, but we've heard from some of you saying that no, really, that you decided to focus on some research questions and then the species followed. So the question is there a path that you think that's harder than the other? I mean, I think you have implicitly answered this question, but if one of you would like to comment some more on what's your preference or what has been your life, your history about choosing the species or choosing the question.
I think Dustin, nailed it. There's two ways of dealing with it. And it's sort of what you're comfortable with. I think, being authentic to yourself is really important. Sometimes, we go places to ask questions and have great questions and then find whatever the dirt common species is and answer it with whatever the dirt common species is. Once you know a system, a species, other questions logically come up and you have greater insight into the sorts of conceptual things that, might be relevant. I got into marmots asking questions about anti-predator behavior, and a lot of my work has been about anti-predator behavior and communication. They're good for that. They alarm call, but there are other questions one can ask as well. So being intellectually nimble and always thinking conceptually, because that's what the grants are going to be based on, and that's what your publications ultimately are going to be based on, is important. I find it a bit annoying when people say this is a marmot story. When I'm trying to frame most of our questions not as marmot stories, but addressing more general topics. So I think that even if you are coming to this through, I like this species, I like this location, you really need to be thinking of it conceptually. And I have to apologize with that. I've really got to disappear. This has been super insightful. I'm learning a lot from everyone on the panel and from your questions, and I would like to stick around, but I really do have to meet with the student. So take care, guys.
Thanks, Dan.
Thank you.
I'm going to give priority, or Lauren, I don't know if you already have the chatting. I'd like to give priority to those who have not asked questions yet. So we have a couple of new participants having questions. So given the time, maybe we should go to those. And the next question comes from Facundo Fernandez Duque.
Hi, yeah, thank you again for all the wonderful answers. So I just started my PhD, so going off of some of the things that have been said about getting good at writing and some of the other advice, I was just wondering, what are some of the best practices early in a PhD for developing a fruitful long-term career and study system? And then also, what are some of the most valuable things to get out of a PhD and to strive for?
I'll answer that. And I'll answer that from the perspective of someone who's in the process of reading hundreds and hundreds of job applications for an assistant professor job. And the three things that strike me that the more impressive applicants have is that they have been tenacious, worked hard, and been really creative. And so they've gained the respect of not just their advisors, but other senior researchers in the field. And so, they've done something different or novel or better than those that came before them. They've been widely focused and read broadly and synthesized the literature, and that helps them be creative and pull things from other sides. So I think that the challenge in a PhD is to become very specialized in what you're studying and be an expert in that. But then you lose the broader picture sometime and fail to make those connections or learn from other fields. And then the third thing is be productive, right? And so that may be incongruent with starting up a long-term system as a PhD student, because that takes time and just to mark your individuals and get your populations and all that sort of stuff. not impossible. I mean, I did it, Christy did it in our PhDs. We were both productive. I think we've been moderately successful. So it's possible, but you know, how can you be productive as a graduate student while also setting the stages to have a system or something that you can take into a postdoc or a job? And that takes the right balance of focus and prioritizing of what you need to do to be able to set up for the long term, but be productive in the short term.
Yeah, I think it's almost easier to ask what not to do, because when I think of like the students in my lab or current PhD students at Princeton, I think sometimes, and someone alluded to this earlier in a comment, trying to be excellent at everything is actually very hard, and that can be a block to productivity and a block to creativity. You know, be excellent at the things that really matter, but know when, you know, perfect is the enemy of done. I think, and I see that it's easy to obsess over things that don't matter as much, and then also to get very discouraged by failure. And that's something that came up as one of the first questions, right? And so, you know, the first paper you submit, it's probably going to come back with things that could cut you to the quick, right? Comments that could be just really hurtful or make you feel like your work is worth nothing. And I think all of us go through periods of time where we feel like where we question the value of what we're doing. But I think the most successful students are able to put those in perspective and just keep going regardless. And so, like Dustin said, being tenacious and knowing when is good enough to stop with the project, I think is also really important.
We have a question coming from our colleagues watching the panel via YouTube. Lauren, do you have the question?
Yes, I do. Okay, so this comes from Eli Strauss. He says, it seems there's a catch-22 in writing a grant to support long-term research project. It's the strength of the system is that the long-term perspectives are available, but these questions might depend primarily on data that's already been collected. And so the question is, what is your strategy for selling the long-term system in your grants without undermining your need for new funding?
Well, I think you need a sufficiently different question each time, right? And part of answering that question will almost certainly rely on past data and the continuation of those data. But in my cases, like I said, to collect long-term demographic data, ban birds, monitor nests, look at reproductive success, et cetera, is relatively cheap, right? It takes X amount of dollars to pay for gas, keep a car running, pay for Kenyan field assistance. And so you can roll that into the grant at a smaller price point than you can to do a bunch of molecular work or something like that. But I think you need a sufficiently novel and new question every time. Otherwise, a reviewer is just going to say it's incremental science, right? I don't think my grants have said that, but I've said that on other people's proposals at times, right? So it's got to be sufficiently different and novel to excite a set of panelists and push the study system in a new direction. But at the same time, you need to be able to continue the long-term data to be able to answer that question.
Adriana, I know there was a question from you, but I hope it's okay with you that I'm skipping. So we're going to go to Birgit Szabo, who has not asked questions yet. Birgit, please, if you would like to introduce yourself.
Yeah, thank you. I'm Birgit Szabo. I'm a postdoc at the University of Bern in Switzerland. So I was wondering, I'm thinking a lot about how privileged we are, especially, from Europe and the United States, North America, and also Australia in, getting the funding, having these opportunities. And I'm thinking a lot about if you develop a new field study, you usually do this in third world countries, Africa or Indonesia. And I feel like I always think about how to pull people up with me from there. So what is your experience in using local students, involving local researchers in your long-term projects?
I've used a number of local Kenyan people as my research assistants, and for the most part, they've been fabulous. Every once in a while, you get somebody who doesn't follow instructions and in fact who can do a fair amount of damage. I had a guy roll one of my very expensive cars and wreck it completely just a year ago. So, it's very variable, but the local people in Kenya and the Kenyan authorities want you to be building capacity as they describe it. So to the extent that, yes, you can help people in the local environment by employing them or training them in other ways, I think it's all for the good.
Thank you.
Most long-term studies operating in Africa do that to a considerable extent, I think. So there are very few studies that don't take in substantial numbers of volunteers from the host country, though they may also take volunteers from overseas too.
Thank you.
Okay, so I'm going to take back over. Thanks to Eduardo for covering for me when my internet went out. I think we're getting towards the end here. This has been a wonderful discussion. And I think maybe a good way to end this is just one last word from the three of you. Something that just summarizes everything up here that the people here can take away. So I'll just give you a minute to think about that. And I think that'd be a great way to end this. And for those we didn't get to, apologize. There have been so many questions. It's been an amazing conversation. And in case I get dropped again, thank you for the panelists for being here. I've been doing a long-term study for 16 years, and I can't tell you how many notes I took down mentally and on paper that have been helpful. So thank you to all of you. And I can say that a couple of my students are here, and I'm very glad that you were able to give them some advice. So thank you for that too. So final words. Kay, let's start with you.
Boy, be tenacious, be creative. Those are the things that you've heard about, and those will really help you get far.
Christina?
I think this has been said in a number of ways, but long-term studies are only worth as much as the shorter term questions are too, so I don't think there's anything special about a long-term study. And most of what we've said today applies to science in general, right? The same skills you need for a long-term study are the same skills you need for doing any kind of research science. And I think doing what you're really interested in, what really makes you happy. If a project doesn't make you happy, it will not become a long-term project.
Tim?
I totally agree with what Christina was saying. I think the only thing I'd add is pick interesting and feasible species where you can collect life history data on individuals from birth to death. If you can do that, you're in a wonderful situation, and you can ask all sorts of interesting questions about it. If you can't do that, you're going to face constraints.
Well, I think that is an amazing amount of advice, great advice for everyone here. And again, let's all thank the panelists. This has been really remarkable, and I really appreciate the three of you being here, and Dan and Dustin, who had to leave, for being here as well. I'm going to end the Zoom, I keep calling it Zoom, I don't know why, the YouTube stream. For those of you who want to stick around, some of us can stay and have a little more informal chat. But if you have to go, again, thanks for being here today. And next week, we'll return to the usual format. I think, Eduardo, is it Julia Fisher next week? Is that correct? Adriana's nodding her head.
Yes,
so.
Yes, Julia Fisher.
Cool. So we'll be learning about primates. And that's it. And